In October 1997, in a quiet suburb of Cedar Falls, Iowa, a 15-year-old girl named Emily Voss walked into her high school on a Tuesday morning and never came home. That part of the story is well documented. What is not documented, what no one has ever been able to explain, is why, 10 years later, when a custodian finally pried open her old locker, they found something inside that should not have been possible. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Cedar Falls, Iowa, in the mid-1990s was a kind of town that appeared in every college brochure about Midwestern charm. It was not a place people associated with tragedy. The community was close. The schools were well-funded. Parents knew their neighbors by name, and most of them had known each other for decades. Cedar Falls High School sat on a wide stretch of land near the edge of town, surrounded by old oak trees that had been there long, before anyone living could remember. The parking lot was never full. The hallways were never loud. It was a kind of school where a student could disappear into routine, so completely that no one would notice anything wrong for days. Emily Voss was not the kind of student anyone would overlook. That is what makes this case so difficult to understand from the very beginning. She was, by every account, present. She was a junior, close to the honor roll, involved in the school newspaper, and well-liked enough that her absence, when it finally registered, created a ripple of genuine concern. Her teachers describe her as steady, reliable, not the type to skip class or break rules. Her mother, Carol Voss, told investigators that Emily had a routine she followed almost without variation. She woke at the same time every morning. She packed her own lunch. She walked to school because it was less than a mile from their house. And she did it in all weather, even in December, because she said she liked the quiet of it. That last detail matters more than it might seem at first. On the morning of Tuesday, October 14th, Carol Voss left for work at her usual time, which was shortly after 7. Emily would have already been gone by then. The walk to school took about 12 minutes, and Emily typically left the house between 6:45 and 6:50. Carol said she did not see Emily that morning, but she also said there was nothing unusual about that. It was a Tuesday. It was an ordinary week. There was nothing on a family calendar, no tension in the house, no reason to think that day would be different from any other. And for the first several hours, it was not. Emily arrived at school. This is confirmed. She was present for first period, which was English. Her teacher, a woman named Margaret Breland, recalled seeing her sit down in her usual seat near the window. She did not appear distracted. She participated in a brief class discussion about a novel they were reading. Mrs. Breland said Emily looked exactly as she always did, calm, slightly quiet, but engaged. Second period was a free period for Emily, and this is where the certainty begins to erode. No one saw her during second period. That alone is not unusual. Free periods are unstructured. Students study in the library, sit in the cafeteria, walk around. Schools in the 1990s did not track student movement the way they do today. There were no key card systems, no cameras in the hallways, no digital check-ins. A student could be anywhere on campus during an unscheduled hour, and no one would question it. But here is what investigators found difficult to reconcile. Emily did not show up for third period. She did not show up for fourth, fifth, or sixth. By the time the final bell rang, she had missed nearly the entire day, and not a single teacher had been notified, and not a single student could say with certainty where she had gone after first period ended. Carol Voss received a call from the school at approximately 4:15 that afternoon. The school's policy at the time was to contact parents if a student missed more than 2 consecutive classes without an excuse. The counselor on the phone told Carol that Emily had not been seen since the morning. Carol said she assumed Emily had gone home sick and simply forgotten to call. She drove to the school, then back to the house, then back to the school again. Emily was not at either location. By 5 o'clock, Carol Voss called the police. The initial response was measured. Cedar Falls was not a city accustomed to missing persons cases, and the officers who responded treated the situation with the same calm efficiency the rest of the town carried. They interviewed Carol. They spoke to the school's administration. They began making calls to Emily's friends, to her father, Richard Voss, who lived in Des Moines, and had limited contact with his daughter, and to anyone else who might know where she had gone. The working assumption in those first hours was simple and reasonable. Emily had left campus voluntarily. She had gone somewhere, a friend's house, a store, somewhere, and had simply not told anyone. Teenagers disappear for an afternoon. It happens. The concern was real, but not yet urgent. That changed overnight. By the morning of October 15th, Emily had not come home. She had not contacted her mother, her father, any of her friends, or any of her teachers. None of her known associates, and the school and police had contacted most of them, had seen or heard from her since the previous morning. The case was upgraded. A formal missing persons report was filed. Local news picked up the story by that evening, and by the end of the week, it had reached regional outlets across Iowa. The investigation that followed was, by most accounts, thorough. Police canvassed the area around the school, the route between the school and the Voss residence, and a wider radius of Cedar Falls. They interviewed dozens of students and staff. They reviewed whatever records they could access. Phone logs, which in 1997 meant landlines, bus schedules, and the school's own attendance records. They spoke to Richard Voss in Des Moines, who had not heard from Emily in over a week before her disappearance, and who had no information that seemed relevant. Within the first 2 weeks, the investigation produced one working theory, and it was the one that most people in Cedar Falls quietly accepted. Emily Voss, investigators suggested, had likely left voluntarily. There were no signs of a struggle anywhere on campus or along her walking route. No physical evidence of an abduction had been recovered. She had no known conflicts with other students that rose to the level of a threat. Her home life, while not perfect, her parents had divorced 2 years earlier, was not described as unstable or abusive by anyone who knew the family. The most probable explanation, police said, was that Emily had made a decision to leave, perhaps prompted by something personal that she had not shared with anyone, and had simply gone. It was a reasonable theory, and for a long time it held. But there are details about Emily Voss's disappearance that do not fit neatly into that explanation, and some of them were not made public until years after the case had gone quiet. The first of these details concerns Emily's locker. Every student at Cedar Falls High School was assigned a locker at the beginning of the school year. The lockers were standard metal combination lock, arranged in rows along the second-floor hallway. When Emily went missing, her locker was sealed. The school did not open it. Her mother did not request that it be opened. There was no legal reason to open it, and no one at the time thought there was any reason to do so either. The locker simply remained closed, and as weeks turned to months and the case faded from daily conversation, no one thought about it again. This was not unusual. Schools in that era did not have rigid policies about the belongings of missing students. There was no procedure in place, no form to fill out, no timeline requiring action. The locker sat there undisturbed, while the rest of Cedar Falls moved on. Emily's locker was not open again until the spring of 2007, nearly 10 years after her disappearance, when the school undertook a renovation of the second-floor hallway. A custodian named David Harwick was tasked with clearing out all the lockers in the affected section before construction began. Most of them were empty. A few contained forgotten textbooks, old notebooks, items that had been left behind by students who had graduated years earlier. But locker 214, Emily's locker, was still locked with its original combination. Harwick cut it open with bolt cutters. Inside there was a textbook, a folder, and a single sheet of paper folded once with writing on it. The writing was not Emily's. The handwriting on that piece of paper was analyzed by 2 separate forensic examiners. Neither could match it to Emily Voss. Neither could identify whose handwriting it was. The content of the note has not been made fully public, but what has been reported is this. The note contained a single sentence, and that sentence referred to Emily in the past tense. At this point, investigators were left with 2 possibilities. Which one would you have believed? The note suggested that whoever wrote it knew something about what had happened to Emily. It also suggested that this person had access to her locker, access that required knowing her combination, or having another way to open it, at some point after she disappeared. The school's records showed that locker combinations were assigned at the beginning of each academic year, and were kept in a file maintained by the school's office. The file was not digitized. It was a paper record, kept in a folder in a filing cabinet in the main office. Anyone with access to that office could have found Emily's combination. That office was not locked during school hours. This detail was noted by investigators in 2007 when the case was briefly reopened after the discovery of the note, but it did not narrow the field of suspects in any meaningful way. The school's main office was accessible to staff, to student aides, and anyone who walked in during the day without drawing attention. At a school the size of Cedar Falls High, that could have been dozens of people. The 2007 investigation lasted approximately 6 weeks before it was effectively shelved. There was no new physical evidence beyond the note itself. There were no new witnesses. The passage of 10 years had made it difficult to reconstruct the events of October 1997 with any precision, and many of the people who had been involved in the original investigation had moved on. Some had retired. Some had left Cedar Falls entirely. The case was not closed officially, but it was no longer being actively pursued. Carol Voss was not satisfied with this outcome. In interviews she gave to local media in 2008 and again in 2011, she expressed frustration not only with the investigation's inability to find her daughter, but with what she described as a pattern of evasiveness from the school district. She said she had requested access to certain records, internal communications, disciplinary files, and the attendance logs from October 1997, and had been told repeatedly that the records either did not exist or could not be released. The school district's position was that many of the paper records from that era had been destroyed during a building renovation in 2003. This was not implausible. Schools routinely dispose of old records once they are no longer required by state or federal retention laws. But Carol Voss noted something that investigators in 2007 had also flagged. The attendance records from October 1997 were among the records reported as destroyed, and those records would have documented exactly when Emily was last marked present and who had been responsible for tracking her through the school day. Without those records, it was impossible to verify the school's account of what had happened on October 14th. There is another detail that has not received much attention, but which Carol Voss raised in a 2011 interview and which remains unresolved. In the weeks following Emily's disappearance, Carol received 2 phone calls on the family's home landline. Both calls came in the evening. Both came from numbers that could not be traced. The technology available to police at the time made it difficult to trace calls that did not leave a message or that were made from payphones. On both calls, the line was open for several seconds before the caller hung up. Carol said she spoke both times, asking if anyone was there. No one responded. The calls stopped after the second one, and they were never explained. Richard Voss, Emily's father, told investigators that he had received no unusual calls during this period. He also told them that he had not spoken to Emily in over a week before her disappearance, which was not uncommon for their relationship. The divorce had been difficult, and contact between Richard and Emily had become sporadic over the preceding year. He was cooperative with investigators, but ultimately provided no information that advanced the case. There was one other person investigators spoke to in 1997 who has come up again in more recent discussions of the case. His name was Thomas Garrett. He was 17 at the time, a senior at Cedar Falls High, and he was one of the last people confirmed to have seen Emily on the morning of October 14th. Garrett said he had seen Emily in the hallway between first and second period. He said they exchanged a few words. He described it as a casual greeting, and then they went their separate ways. His account was consistent with what Mrs. Breland had described, and at the time, investigators saw no reason to treat him as anything other than a witness. Thomas Garrett left Cedar Falls after graduating in 1998. He moved to another state and, as far as public records indicate, has not returned. He has not given interviews about the case. He has not been publicly named as a person of interest at any point in the investigation's history, but his name has surfaced in online discussions of the case, particularly after 2007, when people began speculating about who might have had access to Emily's locker and who might have written the note. There is no evidence connecting Thomas Garrett to Emily's disappearance. None. That distinction matters, and it is important to hold on to it as we move forward. What is equally important is that the investigation never publicly identified anyone else as a person of interest either. By 2012, the case had largely fallen out of public conversation. Cedar Falls had moved on. The school had completed its renovations. The hallway where Emily's locker had once been was indistinguishable from every other hallway in the building. Carol Voss continued to advocate for answers, but her efforts received diminishing coverage, and the local police department maintained that the case remained open in name, but that there were no active leads to pursue. The note from the locker was held in evidence by the Cedar Falls Police Department. Its full contents have never been released to the public. Carol Voss has repeatedly requested access to the note and has been told that releasing could compromise the investigation, even though the investigation has not been actively conducted in years. This is where the case stands today. Emily Voss has never been found. No remains have been recovered. No one has been charged. No one has confessed. The note in the locker remains the only piece of physical evidence recovered after the initial search, and its meaning has never been publicly explained. So what do we actually know, and what are we left to consider on our own? We know that Emily Voss was present at Cedar Falls High School on the morning of October 14, 1997. We know she was seen in first period and in the hallway afterward. We know she did not appear for the remainder of the school day, and we know she did not return home. We know that a note written in an unidentified hand was placed in her locker at some point after her disappearance, and we know that the person who wrote it referred to her in the past tense. We know that the school's attendance records from that day were destroyed, and we know that no one has ever publicly explained why the note was placed in the locker or what it was intended to communicate. What we do not know is considerably larger. We do not know where Emily went after first period. We do not know whether she left the school voluntarily or whether she was taken. We do not know who wrote the note when it was placed in the locker or what it said in full. We do not know why the phone calls came or who made them. We do not know whether the destruction of the school's records was routine or whether it was something else entirely. There are people who have looked at this case and concluded that Emily left on her own, that something in her life, something she kept private, drove her to disappear, and that the note and the phone calls are coincidences that have been inflated by grief and speculation over the years. This is a possibility. It cannot be ruled out. There are others who have looked at the same facts and reached a different conclusion, that Emily did not leave voluntarily, that someone at her connected to that school knew what happened to her, and that the systems which had protected her and found her failed in ways that were never fully examined. The destroyed records, the sealed locker, the silence of the investigation. For these people, the pattern is too consistent to ignore. And there is a third group, smaller and quieter, who simply do not know what to believe. They look at the note, at the fact that someone somewhere wrote a sentence about Emily Voss in the past tense and place it where it would eventually be found, and they cannot decide whether it was a confession, a warning, or something else entirely. Something that does not have a clean name. Carol Voss is still alive. She still lives in Cedar Falls. In her most recent public statement, which was made in 2019, she said something that has stayed with many of the people who have followed this case over the years. She said that the hardest part was not the not knowing. The hardest part was the feeling that someone did know, that the answer existed somewhere, in someone's memory or in a record that had been destroyed, or in a note that the police would not let her read, and that it was being kept from her, not maliciously, perhaps, but kept nonetheless. Whether she is right about that is something no one has been able to confirm or deny. Emily Voss disappeared on a Tuesday morning in October, during a walk she made every single day. She walked into a school she had attended for 3 years, in a town where everyone knew her name, and she did not come out. A decade later, a custodian opened her locker and found a message from someone who knew more than they ever told. Cases like this don't disappear. They just fade when people stop asking questions. If you have thoughts about what might have happened to Emily, or if anything in this case reminded you of something you have seen or read before, leave a comment below. And if you are watching this late at night, alone, wondering how something like this could happen in a place that quiet, know that you are not the first person to sit with that feeling. You won't be the last.